Analyzing Three Zealots. The case of Alvarez was perhaps the most instructive example, to me, of how the United States dealt with its fallen friends. Alvarez, his army, and the Honduran leadership were different from us. They had a strong ideology applauded by the United States. Dedicated anti-Marxists, anti-communists, anti-anything that was socially meaningful or beneficial to the people. Anything that had the word social in it for Alvarez meant communism. He had a true fixation about Nicaragua. "Manuel Antonio," Alvarez said to me one day, "I have a dream. I can see myself riding into Nicaragua on a white horse, freeing the country from the Sandinista communists and taking control." Alvarez tried by all possible means to make his dream come true. Waving an anti-communist and anti-Cuban flag, he wanted to help the United States wage war against Nicaragua. All the time, he was designing his war strategy. It was this ardor in the struggle that convinced the United States to support Alvarez, helping him leapfrog over other officers and take control of the Honduran military. By way of giving thanks to his patrons in Washington, Alvarez opened Honduras up to virtual U.S. control. He and his military in the 1980s took over Panama's role as obedient servant to its North American masters. Alvarez said it was all necessary to fight the Cold War. Yet where did his anti-communist zeal come from? And what did it have to do with Honduras? There were virtually no guerrillas in Honduras, although a small group called the Chinchoneros did eventually emerge, seizing some hostages in Tegucigalpa, then negotiating their way out of the country with the help of mediation by foreign diplomats. Panama had a role in the negotiations, offering to send a plane to fly the guerrillas out of Honduras, guaranteeing their safety until they could leave the area. The Chinchoneros kept their part of the bargain, releasing the hostages, and we sent an Air Force plane to pick them up and take them to Panama City. Alvarez called me, asking me to renege on the bargain and send them back to Honduras. I refused, first of all because we had mediated in good faith, and second, because I knew this would be tantamount to a death sentence for the rebels. Alvarez and I quarreled, but Panama was steadfast. "On diplomatic grounds alone, it can't be done," I told him. "These men were entrusted to our protection." We let the Chinchoneros go, some traveling to Mexico, others to Cuba. We found out later that Honduran intelligence got pictures of all of them, probably, we believed, from someone operating through the Red Cross. And when some of the rebels snuck back into Honduras, Alvarez was able to identify them and had them killed one by one. Alvarez and I often argued, but we treated each other with respect. He knew that I was neither a Marxist nor a communist, but a supporter of these groups that he hated so much. The problem that ideologues had with Panama was that they couldn't figure us out. We made friends based on our own value system. Chile was a good example. The Panamanian military had respectful relations with its Chilean military counterparts. But when General Augusto Pinochet seized power from Salvador Allende on September 11, 1973, we set out to provide asylum to as many people as we could. There was much concern in Panama upon hearing the news of the Chilean coup, since hundreds of our countrymen, students, leftists, even some opponents of the Panamanian military, were living there. I called my counterpart, as that country's intelligence chief, General Augusto Lutz, knowing he had become a member of the new military junta, and used that contact to help rescue many Panamanians, Chileans, and others. My friend briefed me on events, then put Pinochet on the line. I recognized the general's distinctive voice. He told me he had a daughter living in Panama and feared reprisals against her by leftist opponents. Without his asking, I told him I would guarantee her security, which I did, although there were never any incidents. In the days that followed, Pinochet's military rounded up thousands of Allende supporters. Panama became a lifeline for people detained by Pinochet or threatened with arrest. I asked our very able ambassador, Joaquin Mesa, to go to the now infamous Santiago soccer stadium, where suspected leftists and opponents were later reported as having been tortured and killed. Panama managed to liberate at least 1,200 people, doctors, intellectuals, students, men, women, and children. In particular, I remember the case of a 3-year-old girl named Macarena Franqui Marsh, whose father was a leftist activist. It was known that the father was in the hands of Chilean military police, the DINA, but the little girl was missing and believed held captive, it was said, perhaps to apply pressure on her father. Mesa heard the story and used his diplomatic prowess, along with the goodwill I had with Pinochet, to rescue the little girl. I was also able to help a United Nations official and members of the musical group Canta America, among others, detained by the military regime. Mesa filled the Panamanian embassy in Santiago with refugees, and when the building could not hold a soul more, Torrijos let us buy 2 additional buildings to hold more refugees under our diplomatic umbrella. Years later, when I became commander of the Panamanian military, I went to Santiago for a hemispheric meeting of military chiefs. Pinochet invited me for a private dinner at his home with his wife and daughter. Ambassador Mesa was also there. Pinochet was in an ebullient mood. "Well, you Panamanians sure did save a lot of those Marxists. I'll bet it was something like 2,000 of them," he said. "Tell me one thing, General Noriega. Have they ever thanked you?" Alvarez's attempts to provoke a war proved his undoing. The United States wanted the Contras to overthrow Nicaragua, and they wanted to act as an unseen player in that game. They did not seek a highly visible, overt approach, and that was what Alvarez was leading them toward. Eventually, this meant that Alvarez, for reasons very different from the U.S. interest in getting rid of me, became a problem. I refused to help them in Nicaragua. Alvarez wanted to do too much. So suddenly one fine day, there was a coup in Tegucigalpa. Coming from the quarter where one would least expect it, Alvarez's closest friends, fellow officers in the Honduran Air Force. The United States helped plan and instigate the coup. The armed forces seized their commander, tied him up, and sent him packing out of the country to Costa Rica. The moment chosen for the uprising against Alvarez was important. The United States had been hosting a mini-course on military intelligence and operations at Fort Gulick, one of its military bases in the former Canal Zone. Among those attending the course were a number of Alvarez's key men. I remember giving the closing speech and later attending a reception for them at the Hotel Continental that evening. All of us were unaware of the trouble brewing back in Honduras. The news came out the following morning with the word that General Walter Lopez was the new head of the Honduran Armed Forces. Later the same day, I received a message from Costa Rica. Alvarez wanted to talk to me. When the phone hookup was finally made, the man on the other end of the line was an Alvarez who sounded in a far different frame of mind than the man I knew. Alternately bitter, defeated, tearful, without hope, then violent, grasping for possibilities, beseeching me for support. "What can I do for you?" I said finally, unable to think of anything that could unseal his fate. "Manuel Antonio, call General Paul Gorman for me," he said, referring to the head of the U.S. Southern Command. "I haven't been able to reach him, but Manuel Antonio, please, tell General Gorman, tell him about what they have done to me. Tell him that I am in hiding here in Costa Rica. Tell him everything I have told you." I did, in fact, get in touch with Gorman. "Oh, yes, we know about that. Thanks for the call," Gorman said, dismissing the whole matter and promptly changing the subject. I could see that Gorman indeed knew a lot about Alvarez's fortunes and that nothing was likely to change. All of this would be inconsequential, except for the fact that not many days later, I had a visit from the CIA agent, obviously aware that I was in touch with Alvarez. "Alvarez is going to the United States," the agent said. "Please send him this money through the BCCI account." The gift was a large quantity of cash. I sent it to Alvarez and he went to live in exile in the United States. I was fascinated by the whole process, but I just couldn't understand the Americans. They thought everything would be made all right with money. It was beyond cynicism. It was disconnected from reality. "Let's send something to pacify him, to take care of him and his wife and children, and to keep him quiet. He's done his job for us, and now it's over." Years later, the Americans tried the same thing with me. $2 million seemed to be the going price for a military commander to give up his nation's sovereignty. Alvarez was in the back of my mind, and all the money they could offer me wasn't enough to get me to leave Panama. It wasn't the only time they tried.